The sun was just dipping behind the serrated line of the Sierra Madre Mountains, casting long shadows over the dusty town of Dry Creek. The saloon doors swung open and shut with a familiar creak, the rattle of spurs and murmured conversations spilling into the cooling air. Luke, Dusty McGrath, a lean man with sun-beaten skin and eyes like storm clouds, sat nursing a whiskey at the bar. The town had been quiet lately, but word had come from the cavalry, the Apache had been stirring again. Raids on the cattle drives and wagon trains growing bolder. The local ranchers wanted that to end. And they'd promised a handsome reward to anyone who could bring back proof of a capture, alive or dead. Dusty wasn't one for heroics, but gold was gold, and times were hard. He knew the risks better than most, having roamed these borderlands for years, trading gunfire and stories in equal measure. Across the room, a group of men leaned in, speaking low and sharp. They eyed Dusty, waiting for him to take the bait. He stood, the weight of his Colt heavy at his hip, and nodded. "I'm in." The next day, Dusty rode hard into the rugged canyons where the Apache were said to camp. The wind whipped dust through the pines, and every crack of a twig made his hand twitch toward his gun. Hours passed with nothing but silence and shadows. Then, by a trick of the light, he spotted movement, a small figure darting between the rocks. He gave chase, heart pounding, until he cornered a young Apache woman beside a narrow creek. Her dark eyes flashed defiance, but exhaustion weighed on her slender frame. "I'm bringing you in," Dusty said, trying to keep his voice steady. She didn't answer, only stared. Back in Dry Creek, the men who'd promised gold eyed her with cold calculation. To them, she was a prize, a trophy to be traded or sold. The words slave and servitude hung heavy in the smoky air, and Dusty felt a cold knot twist in his gut. But the reward was promised, and a promise in the West was a bond, no matter how dirty the price. The Apache woman, whose name was Nayeli, sat silently in the corral, watching the stars blink awake, one by one. Neither she nor Dusty knew then how their fates would twist and turn, bound together not by chains, but by the harsh land and the uncertain mercy of men. The morning sun dragged itself up over the horizon, spilling light across the dusty streets of Dry Creek and setting the wooden storefronts ablaze with a golden fire. Dusty McGrath sat on the worn bench outside the general store, his legs stretched out, boots scuffed and dusty from the ride. His fingers idly traced the grip of his Colt, the weight of it a familiar comfort. The town was waking, but Dusty's mind wasn't on the usual chatter or the clatter of horse hooves. Nayeli was in the corral, tethered by a leather strap, her dark eyes watching the horizon with a fire that unsettled him. She was no prisoner in his mind, not yet anyway, but the others treated her like a beast, something to be owned and bartered. He knew the law was on the side of the ranchers and the government, but the law didn't know the land like he did. It didn't understand the Apache's fight to hold on to what was theirs. He stood, brushing dust off his trousers, and approached the corral. Nayeli turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to hate me," Dusty said, his voice low. "I'm just doing what I gotta do." Her lips pressed tight, and she said nothing. That silence spoke volumes, and Dusty felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. The men in the saloon had promised gold a reward to the man who could bring in a captured Apache. Dusty had thought it would be a quick job, maybe a few scraps with a raiding party, but it had turned out to be something far more complicated. Nayeli's perspective chains, both seen and unseen, bound Nayeli in that dusty corral. Her wrists bore the sting of the leather strap, but her spirit fought harder than any rope could. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying memories of her home, the mesas, the red dirt, the song of the coyotes under a full moon. She had been taken from her people, a prize in a cruel game she had no say in. The white men spoke of rewards and money, but to Nayeli, she was nothing more than a shadow in their world, a ghost trapped between freedom and captivity. Yet, even in captivity, her eyes burned with a fierce light. She studied Dusty, the man who had brought her here. There was something different in him, something not quite like the others. He didn't look at her with the same coldness. His eyes were haunted, as if he carried a weight she couldn't understand. Nayeli remembered the chase, the sound of hooves pounding, the sharp crack of Dusty's voice telling her to stop. She had tried to run, tried to vanish into the rocks and brush, but fate had other plans. Now, in the quiet moments before dawn, she wondered what this strange man wanted from her, and whether the promise of gold was worth the price she was forced to pay. Back to Dusty. Dusty's gaze lingered on Nayeli a moment longer before he turned away. The town had its eyes on him now, waiting for proof that the Apache threat was ending, that their cattle and women were safe once more. But Dusty knew the truth was messier than any tale told over whiskey and poker games. The promise of money had dragged him into a world of shadows, where right and wrong blurred under the endless sky. He tucked his hat low, feeling the heat rise in his chest. The road ahead was long, and the choices he'd make in the coming days would shape not just his fate, but hers as well. The sun rose slow and unforgiving, burning away the night's chill and casting a harsh light across the dry earth. Nayeli sat quietly by the edge of the corral, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt, a small act of defiance, a way to hold on to herself in a place that sought to erase her. She thought of the mountains that cradled her homeland, the rust-red cliffs where the wind sang through ancient stone. There, she had been free. Here, she was a possession, a promise broken by men who traded lives for gold. Dusty McGrath had brought her here, but he wasn't like the others. She saw it in the way his eyes softened when he looked her way, in the silence that stretched between them when words failed. Still, trust was a dangerous thing, and Nayeli kept her heart guarded like a hawk over its nest. A sudden movement caught her eye, Dusty approaching, his spurs jangling softly with each step. "Come with me," he said, voice low and careful. She hesitated, then rose, following him away from the dusty corral, toward the edge of town. They walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of boots on gravel, and the distant murmur of the town waking up. Dusty stopped at a weathered wooden fence overlooking a narrow creek. The water trickled quietly, reflecting the sky's pale blue. "I know it ain't much," he said, "but I figured you might want to see a bit of something that ain't chains." Nayeli watched him, studying the lines of his face, the way the morning light caught the grit in his hair. "Why?" she asked finally, voice rough. Dusty shrugged. "Maybe 'cause I'm tired of this whole mess. Tired of the promises that don't mean nothing. Tired of being part of it?" Her eyes narrowed. "Then why did you bring me here?" He looked away, the weight of the question settling heavy. "I had to. The men were waiting for proof. Gold was promised. But that don't mean I got no regrets." For the first time since they met, Nayeli saw something fragile in him, a crack in the armor of the man who'd chased her down. Back at the saloon, the talk was all about the captured Apache. Men swaggered with exaggerated bravado, slapping Dusty on the back and spinning tales of how they'd handle the situation if they were in his boots. But Dusty barely heard them. His mind was tangled with thoughts of Nayeli, the way she moved, the silent strength she carried, even in chains. He wondered what story she carried inside, the life she left behind. He found a quiet corner, pulling out a worn notebook from his saddlebag. The pages were filled with sketches and notes, a habit he'd picked up to keep his thoughts straight on long rides. He sketched a rough outline of Nayeli's face, the sharpness of her eyes captured with shaky lines. His fingers lingered over the paper, reluctant to put down what he saw, not just a prize or a slave, but a person. The door creaked open, and a rough-voiced rancher called out, "McGrath, you've done yet? The men want to see the girl." Dusty folded the notebook slowly and stood, coming as he walked toward the corral. He felt the weight of the world pressing down, the promise of gold feeling heavier with each step. He wasn't sure what awaited him, but he knew one thing: this wasn't the end of their story. The afternoon sun burned high, casting sharp shadows on the wooden buildings lining Dry Creek's main street. Dusty's boots thudded against the weathered planks as he made his way toward the saloon, where the townsfolk awaited his return with the captured Apache woman. His mind churned like the wind, whipping the loose dirt across the street. The gold promised was a beacon, but it had brought more trouble than he'd bargained for. Men weren't interested in her story, or her spirit. They wanted proof, a trophy, something to show for their fears and anger. Inside the saloon, the chatter hushed as Dusty entered, eyes following him like a pack of wolves tracking their prey. He glanced toward the corral, where Nayeli sat, watching with a guarded silence. A rough-voiced rancher named Hank approached, slapping a heavy hand on Dusty's shoulder. "You brought her in. Good job, McGrath. Now hand her over. We've got a deal to close." Dusty felt the weight of those words settle heavy in his gut. "She's not just a thing, Hank." Hank snorted. "She's part of the price. You want your gold? You do what's expected." Dusty's jaw clenched, but he knew the fight wouldn't be won here. Later, he found Nayeli sitting beneath a solitary mesquite tree, the shade a small comfort against the relentless sun. "I don't like the way they see you," he said quietly. She looked up, eyes sharp. "They see what they want to see." Dusty exhaled slowly. "You don't have to be their prisoner." Her gaze softened for a moment. "What choice do I have?" "Maybe more than you think." Nayeli's perspective days bled into each other, each one a struggle against the invisible chains tighter than any leather strap. Nayeli's world had shrunk to the bounds of the corral, and the eyes of men who saw her as little more than a possession. But Dusty was different. He spoke to her in moments when others would only sneer or shout commands. He didn't pretend to understand her, but there was a respect there. Tentative and fragile, she studied the lines of his face, weathered and worn, but honest. The man who had hunted her down now seemed to carry the burden of what he'd done. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky with streaks of crimson, Dusty shared stories of the land of the mountains and rivers, the wide-open spaces that held secrets and dangers alike. Nayeli listened, a small spark kindling inside her chest. It was strange, this connection with the man who was both captor and reluctant companion. But trust was a slow thing to grow, and the wound of her capture ran deep. "I won't forget what this land cost me," she said softly, "or the lives it's taken." Dusty nodded. "Neither will I." Their fates were now tangled in ways neither could foresee, bound by promises broken and the uncertain hope that somewhere beneath the endless sky, freedom might still find them. Dusty's perspective. Dusty sat on the rickety porch of the Dry Creek jailhouse, the nights settling in with a quiet that felt heavier than the day's heat. His eyes traced the horizon where the last embers of sunlight faded into a blanket of stars. The reward was no longer just about gold. It had become a weight pressing down on his conscience, a silent whisper reminding him of the line he'd crossed, chasing down Nayeli, a woman who was more than a prize, more than a symbol of the frontier's brutal reckoning. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps. Nayeli emerged from the shadows, her figure slender and poised despite the weariness etched into her features. "You think there's a way out?" she asked quietly. Dusty looked at her, searching for the strength he suspected was buried beneath her quiet resolve. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I reckon there's more than one kind of freedom." She nodded slowly, the flicker of hope sparking in her eyes. "Not all chains are made of leather." Nayeli's perspective. The nights in Dry Creek were colder than the days, a chill that seeped into her bones. Yet, it was the uncertainty that gnawed at her, the questions that no one dared to ask aloud. Why had Dusty spared her spirit when he could have treated her like the others? Why had he spoken to her with a gentleness that felt almost like kindness? She remembered the faces of her people, the sound of the wind through the canyons, the stories her mother told under the stars. Those memories were her sanctuary, a place where the white man's chains could not reach. But now, tied to Dusty by circumstance, she wondered if survival meant forging an unlikely alliance. "Do you think they'll come for me?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Dusty hesitated. "Maybe, or maybe they're just waiting for the right time." Her gaze hardened. "Then we better be ready." Dusty's perspective. The following day, Dusty found himself at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. The path ahead was uncertain, shadowed by the demands of a town eager for victory and a woman whose fate rested in his hands. As he mounted his horse, he looked back at Nayeli, standing strong despite the invisible chains. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. The promise of gold had led him into a story far greater than himself. A story where honor, redemption, and survival intertwined beneath the relentless western sky. Dusty's perspective. The early morning air was sharp and cold as Dusty rode out of Dry Creek, the weight of the day settling heavy on his shoulders. The promise of gold still dangled in the back of his mind, but something deeper pulled at him, a gnawing sense of responsibility. And maybe, just maybe, something like regret. He glanced at the narrow trail winding through the scrub brush, the landscape stretching out wide and wild, unforgiving and honest. Beside him rode Nayeli, her eyes fixed ahead with a fierce determination that unsettled him. The men back in town didn't understand her, didn't see the fire beneath her quiet strength. But Dusty was beginning to see things differently. He wondered if this journey might be more than a simple capture. Maybe it was a chance for something new. A crackle of movement in the brush made Dusty's hand tighten on the reins. They both paused, tension coiling like a spring. Out of the shadows stepped a group of mounted men, faces grim and eyes hard. "McGrath," one said, spitting the name like a curse. "We've come to collect." Dusty's heart thudded, but he stood firm. "She's not just some prize to be dragged back." The men exchanged glances, hands hovering near their guns. The air was thick with unspoken threats. But Dusty squared his shoulders. "If you want her, you're gonna have to go through me." Nayeli's perspective. Tension was a living thing out here, coiling around them like a rattlesnake ready to strike. Nayeli's hand instinctively went to the small knife she'd hidden beneath her skirt, a token of her past and her will to fight. She watched Dusty stand his ground, a flicker of respect stirring inside her. Maybe, just maybe, this man wasn't like the others. As the men advanced, Nayeli's mind raced through every lesson she'd learned from her people: patience, strategy, the art of survival. "Whatever happens," she whispered to Dusty, We face it together. The word surprised even her. Trust was still a fragile thread, but in this harsh land, it might be the only lifeline they had. Dusty's perspective, the standoff stretched on, the sun climbing higher, casting harsh light on faces hardened by fear and hatred. Words were useless here, only action spoke. Dusty's hand hovered near his Colt, ready, but not eager. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a sudden motion, the tension broke. The men hesitated, unsure whether to draw or back down. Dusty took a step forward, voice steady. "She's more than what you think. And if you don't see that, then maybe it's time this story changed." The men muttered among themselves, and slowly, the group pulled back, melting into the scrub-like shadows at dusk. Dusty exhaled, relief washing over him. He glanced at Nayeli, who nodded, a silent promise in the face of a harsh world. Their path was still uncertain, but in that moment, beneath the endless western sky, something unspoken passed between them. A fragile bond forged in fire and trust. Dusty's perspective, a horizon stretched wide and endless as Dusty and Nayeli rode side by side through the dusty plains. The townsfolk of Dry Creek would never understand what had passed between them, the silent respect, the shared glances, the understanding that had grown despite chains and promises broken. Dusty's hand rested lightly on his Colt, but his mind was far from the gun. He thought of the gold that had seemed so important once, now just a shadow behind the weight of what mattered most, honor, and the courage to make things right. "Where we headed?" Nayeli's voice was soft, carrying the hint of a question, but also a challenge. Dusty glanced over, the corners of his mouth twitching with a tired smile. "Somewhere, the sky's wide enough for both of us to breathe." They rode on in silence, the sun dipping low and casting the world in shades of fire and gold. For the first time since the capture, there was no promise to break. Only the open road and the chance for a new beginning. Nayeli's perspective, the weight of the past still pressed at her shoulders, but it no longer felt like a chain. With Dusty beside her, the future stretched out like the endless desert, wild and uncertain, but hers to claim. She thought of her people, the land she'd been torn from, and the fight still burning deep in her heart. But she also thought of this man, flawed and haunted, but honest in a way few had been. "We're not so different," she said quietly, both caught between worlds. Dusty nodded. "Maybe that's why we find each other." The stars began to blink awake overhead, the vast western sky a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was light to be found. As the night wrapped around them, Dusty and Nayeli rode on, two souls bound by broken promises, bound by a land that was as cruel as it was beautiful, bound by a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find freedom together.